Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'm very honored to moderate this eminent panel, or this panel of eminent personalities. We are going to talk about the role of rising powers in the world of today. And maybe I would start by a somewhat controversial proposal, which is to say rising powers should play a bigger role in security issues, in war and peace issues. And of course, that opens a lot of questions, the use of force, the Security Council, the role and the need for reform of the Security Council. Also, settlement of concrete crises, and unfortunately, there are many crises in the world of today. Though a great range of issues connected with the role of potential of rising powers in the security of the world. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, you have the right to disagree, of course, and even to disagree strongly if you feel so. But I'd like you to react on this initial proposal. And maybe we will start according to the plan with Minister Celso Amorim. Minister, what would you say about this issue of how the rising powers could take a bigger role in the security of the world?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think never it has been so important to speak about peace as now. I mean, I'm quite an old guy. I'm 81 years old. I don't think I have seen two wars happening at the same time, two wars which may be to some extent even intertwined. So I think we are in an extremely important moment to discuss that. Of course, you can discuss that in abstract, or you can discuss that in concrete terms. I think I should praise President Macron for calling the meeting on Gaza, because this was already one way of having rising power, other powers, and maybe even declining powers discussing together such an important issue. But if you want to say in a more theoretical way, I've a long time worked on the question of expansion of Security Council. I know how difficult it is, how problematic it is, and I think, as it happened actually in the past also, that in a way the reform of the Council with a greater role for rising powers has to come from outside to some extent. And I think the closest thing that we have nowadays, which combines some sort of efficiency, not complete efficiency, but some sort of efficiency with representativeness, is the G20. It would have to be the G20 slightly corrected, a little more African and a little less European. Too many Europeans, the Council, the Commission, and so on and so forth, and too few Africans. I mean, now we allowed, I mean, South Africa was already there, and now there is the African Union. But we should have at least two more African countries as such to be there. And why? Because they have, you know, there is something to be said for experience. I have to say that, of course, but there is also something to be said in favor of capacity to innovate and to capacity to find new solutions. So in a very simple way, I think the G20, with these corrections that I mentioned, and with the participation of all the countries that are there, which are quite independent from ideology, it has to be the United States, it has to be France, it has to be Russia, China, whatever, but also Brazil, India, and South Africa, whatever. So these countries all have to be there, and Algeria maybe. So they have to be there to contribute to new solutions to old problems.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now, Nirjan Reddy, what would be your take on this issue? Seen from India, if I may say so.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, organizers. I may just want to broad base the question you put to me. One, what would be rising powers? Are we looking at rising powers only from an economic perspective? I think we need to have more indices. The human capital, number of people, the kind of resources that a country may have. It may not have achieved economic progress, but a lot of these indices need to be built in to find what will be a rising power. Now, second, when we say that the rising powers need to have a greater say in security, I may want to just broad base and expand that security not just to law and order security. I may want it to be increased to food security, climate security, cyber security, and other forms of security, because that is when it actually becomes a larger governance issue and it becomes more inclusive. I was following keenly what Celso said about the necessity of expanding the or changing the UN. I quite agree with him, because I think we have a few legacy issues where we have had a colonization of institutions by few people. This has led to a sense of some countries feeling left out. So specific to the topic we are discussing today, I think when we speak of rising countries, I think they also want to have an increased rising voice at the important tables. So yes, I think we need to have more inclusivity, but I think we need to have that inclusivity on some larger issues.
Thank you very much. Fatah Nagad, who has played an important part in various structures in Africa. What I'd like you to do is to challenge the views of the two previous speakers. And especially this notion by Minister Amorim of G20, but G20 has no specific legitimacy. He can't take the role of the UN body. And Niranjan, okay, security means also environment, climate, or human security, and many things. But after all, in the world of today, war and peace is becoming again, unfortunately, central. So what would be your own answer to that?
Thank you very much also for the Paris Peace Forum for the invitation. I don't know if I will challenge. I think I will just speak frankly and certainly more from the perspective of where I'm sitting. I think the first point that I wanted to raise is that what is important to emphasize is that for the African continent, a functioning global order that is balanced is extremely critical. I think we are very conscious that even our biggest countries do need multilateralism to be functioning and do need functional international institutions to help us advance our interests collectively, because it's very much about the alliances that we build. It's very much about how open that system is, how diverse and representative it is to allow us to do that. So in that sense, I think I think certainly from the African perspective, the holy position of multilateralism is quite centered. Now, that multilateralism as it exists today is not in our favor. And it's not a multilateralism that allows international institutions to do the work that they're supposed to do. The minister raised the question of the Peace and Security Council. We've been for decades now calling for the reforms of the Security Council. There's a huge skepticism on whether those reforms will lead to change, and certainly not from within. So the question is the pressure from beyond. And we already see, for instance, the General Assembly trying to shift some of that power towards it. But we need to think of new configurations, and I think the G20 has started opening some space. It's not yet there. I think certainly the African Union, addition of the African Union to the G20 is positive, and we will need to take a huge advantage of it. But we will need more diversification in the G20 framework. But we will also need the G20 to avoid the trap of becoming a new club that may sideline again regions such as Africa, but that will depend obviously on how we will engage with it. I think in relation to that, I think the key question is maybe to come back to your point, Michelle, is on security and how do we define security. I think the mandate of the G20 and the focus of the G20 has so far been very much around finance, around trade, those kind of questions. But I think bringing in, and inevitably, by the way, it's already being impacted by peace and security related issues, as we've seen on Ukraine. But I think more and more the economics have an impact also on the security. And so we will need to reflect on a bit more on that interplay between the two. And perhaps the question of inequality is a good entry point there. It opens the space on human security and its multiple dimensions.
Thank you very much. Now it would be, of course, very interesting to have a Chinese viewpoint on this issue.
So you want me to challenge the
Yeah, you can. Let's be comfortable. I will disagree completely with what has been said until now. So you have also the right to disagree.
Okay, I probably will take the same approach as you did, and just to put it up front, I'm not a geopolitics expert. I'm from a philanthropy background, so I just wanted to kind of express my view from a average Chinese. I mean, living in this world, having gone through what has gone through, and just to express some of my views on that. I mean, China wants to have a more important role on the world stage, right? That's very obvious. I mean, I think all the, attendees. I heard that from many distinguished speakers. That's for sure. And the U.S. is hesitating. I mean, to say the least, right? That's the sort of the narrative, and also the trade war, and also the 3 years of COVID in China. I mean, I don't know, many of you might realize that we actually had 3 years of COVID. And so for me, I used to work for a US NGO. I managed China. And I visited New York this April, and that was the first time I was in the US after 3 years. I mean, I consider myself like I travel quite internationally. And not being able to travel like outside of China for 3 years, I mean, that's unimaginable. I mean, not just for me, but for many people. So again, I mean, the trade war and also the 3 year COVID, I think really have decoupled two of the largest economies in the world, really. So that's the narrative. And also, I mean, China is trying very hard to build its own infrastructure. So now it's November. So last month, October, President Xi Jinping just celebrated the 10th year anniversary of One Belt, One Road initiative. So that's a very, clear indication that, China is trying to figure out a way to work internationally. I mean, sort of beyond the U.S.-China relationship. So I think a lot of experts have already discussed the sort of the U.S.-China dynamic, and I think one thing I look forward to see is next week, right? I mean, President Xi Jinping and President Biden are meeting in the U.S., and I did my little research before coming on stages. This is actually the first U.S. trip for President Xi Jinping in 5 years. Mm-hmm. So this is huge. So I'm saying that even though I think the U.S., China, I mean, they have their own challenges, but a lot of the Chinese elites are actually educated in the West. So, I mean, I went to the U.S. for my undergraduate degree. I got my MBA. I did my investment banking in New York. So a good percentage of my career, I mean, is in the U.S. And also I had a very interesting conversation with, I shouldn't be saying the company name, but the chairman of a very prominent financial company. And he said he very much appreciates a stable U.S.-China relationship because he benefited, I mean, from that relationship. So for us, is very difficult to react to the current sort of a status between U.S. and China because we benefited, I mean, from that relationship, and now, I mean, the relationship is getting more and more difficult, and we also need to figure out a way, I mean, to find new friends and work with new friends. But all these things are so new for us. So we're still trying to figure out, so what does it mean? I mean, a more proactive China-Europe strategy, right? What does it mean? I mean, how do we position ourselves in Africa, right? So all these things, I think, a lot of the attention, a lot of the energy have been occupied by the U.S.-China sort of, decoupling. And I really think that, I mean, after gone through the sort of the 5 years of, going back and forth, I really felt that it is really a turning point that we would have to, look beyond. What does it mean for China internationally? Go beyond the sort of the U.S.-China sort of dynamics. I don't know if that answers your...
No, thank you very much. But maybe let me ask you something else. Do you think that when President Biden and President Xi will meet, they will talk about the Middle East, of course? And probably President Biden will make a call for you, or for your country, to contribute to stabilize the situation and talk to the Iranians and so on. Is it for you the right way to do? Is it potentially a positive avenue?
Well, I don't know if I'm in a position to give comments. Or historically, we're very conservative. We say things carefully, and when we say things, we usually do them. So I think it would be. That would really depend on, all the pre-work that going sort of, has gone before the meeting and what has been decided already. I don't think if President Biden decides to propose something sort of at the meeting, President Xi will be in the position to agree or disagree with the proposal. So. I know I'm not answering your question, but I'm just saying that, this is a very important meeting, and I've been following Chinese news for the past week, and the tone has already changed. So all the state media are putting a very positive tone on this potential meeting. So the expectation is high, but U.S. will have its election next year. There's really a lot of uncertainties, right? So my fear is China having this high expectation going to this meeting, but what if the return is not what we expect, and how does the sort of the relationship go from here to there. Especially, I think, I mean, for the past day and a half, we all heard that, I mean, given all the crises, challenges going on around the world, we would really appreciate a more stable U.S.-China relationship. So that's why I think, I mean, next week the meeting is super important, and we have high expectations.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amorim, Brazil will chair the G20 in a few months from now. As you said, case can be made that G20 could also play a part in security issues, and everybody, all of us, you said already that everything is connected. That's obvious. Do you think that Ukraine and the Middle East could be part of the agenda of the Brazilian presidency of the G20?
Well, first of all, let me just emphasize another point that was made before, which is the question of inequality. I think the main problem, the horizontal question that will be in all different sections, will be the question of inequality, which is also, to a large extent, the source of many of the conflicts. Not all, maybe, but many of the conflicts. I think it would be rather difficult to have Ukraine and Israel or Palestine or whatever as a subject in itself. But of course, I think it is very probable that this question may be discussed. Let me just emphasize one point. The summit of G20 is only next year, so this is not a subject to be dealt with by technicians or experts. It's a subject to be dealt by heads of state. So I would hope that at least one of these conflicts would have been limited, if not solved, before the summit. I think what President Macron did is very positive in terms of discussing Gaza from a humanitarian angle. And I think probably would have, and I even suggested that in the meeting, that we should broaden that in order to have a discussion which is not only about the immediate humanitarian question, which of course is the most urgent, but also that we could move from there to a more structural discussion of how can we channel the solution for the Israeli-Palestine question. And I think this is it's a mistake when you call it Israel-Hamas question, because this is really Israeli-Palestinian question, which doesn't diminish the barbarian act of Hamas. But I think you have to look at it in a broader way. The same way, if I may say something, although we don't support, on the contrary, we condemned very clearly the invasion of Russia, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But on the other hand, this is not only a Ukraine-Russia question. This is a Russia-NATO question as well. So if you don't look at it from that point of view, you won't be able to solve these questions. But I mean, these are broader questions that you cannot solve in one aspect. Let me just, if I may, one thing that I would like to mention, because very often we have heard in this context a rules-based order. And this is certainly an expression which I don't like. I don't think it's a rules-based order. It's an international law that you have to take into account. Because who makes the rules? How long do they last? We don't know. So that is just a comment which I don't know if I would have another chance to make. So.
No, in France, we don't use this wording, the rules-based order.
For France.
From a French point of view, there is international law, of course. But that maybe will bring me to another important issue related to this world of war and peace, and war more than peace, unfortunately, which is the issue of the use of force. Because, Minister, you remember after the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, Secretary General Kofi Annan launched a process of reflection about the reform of the UN. And one central issue of this reform should have been, it failed completely, but should have been how to make a new consensus about the rule of use of force. That is to say, there is something profoundly disturbing when one of the major powers was not respecting the UN Charter and didn't ask for the UN Security Council for an authorization of the use of force. But I must say that at that time, the US, at least, they went to the Security Council, and there was a number of meetings and some discussion about the Iraqi crisis, even if at the end, as everybody knows, they didn't choose to request the authorization of the UNSC, and they went alone. But in the case of Ukraine, what is very troubling is that there has been not even an attempt to discuss at the level of the Security Council. And so now we are in a world of a mere aggression by one of the permanent member of the Security Council, and with the risk that it will create a precedent, another precedent, if I may say so, and there could be a generalization of aggressions in the world. And you see already other so-called frozen conflicts which are not frozen anymore. And it seems to me, once again, I'd like to challenge you on that. It's a big challenge for all of us, including for rising powers and not only for declining powers, even though I don't see who, of course, would accept this, this wording. Do you want to say something about that?
See, again, it takes me back to why the League of Nations or the UN was formed. I mean, this was more when the world was unidimensional, when security was the primary concern, and these were born out of the resolutions after the war. But to my mind, the necessity of having an effective multilateral forum today is so much stronger and necessary. If you look at the large issues that are confronting the world, now the world is committed to achieving the self-development goals, SDGs, by 2030. We have the climate issue where the world will have to come together. Food security is going to be a challenge where the world may have to act together. There's an increasing digital divide that needs to be bridged. There is artificial intelligence, which possibly may need to be regulated, and it may have to be regulated across boundaries and territories. Health security is something that, again, I was part of a session in the morning which was dealing with genome editing. And we were discussing the limitations of boundaries and territories for subjects like artificial intelligence, genome editing. We have the necessity of multilateral bodies and banks. Now, all of this, when you look at where the world is headed, the necessity of having an effective multilateral forum is much stronger. And this is where we find that because of a few security breaches, United Nations ceased to be what it was. I think the architecture of the Security Council is flawed. You can't have a non-universality as the core of United Nations. So that is why I think there has been a trust erosion that has happened in United Nations, and the world needs something like the United Nations, which is effective the most at this point of time because of the multiple challenges that that the world is facing. So the necessity is now, and we don't have a proper architecture in place. So I agree with my speaker on my left who said that there is going to be a challenge because the world needs this multilateral forum. And if the Security Council is not able to correct itself from within, if the powers that constitute the Security Council or constitute who have a major voice within United Nations are not going to mend the United Nations, I agree with my friend that the challenge is going to be coming from outside. When you see today a BRICS expansion, you see a Quad forming, you see different groups coming together. And I think that earlier, when we had a United Nations or a League of Nations, it was a top-down approach. It was something that the whole world agreed to and something that came from above. Now, that is not working. So when you have the smaller groupings coming together, I think eventually all of them possibly will coalesce into some form of an effective world organization that can take care of all these concerns of the world. But yes, the necessity is very, very large. I agree with you that a security breach that has happened more than once now possibly will lead to a license for some other entities to think that the rules-based order or the world security order is not in place. But to my mind, while that is the single most biggest immediate concern, there are a lot of other things that are catching up with us. We need to wake up. We need to have a multilateral forum that is going to be effective. Otherwise, I think we may be running behind these problems and it may be too late to catch up.
But would you say that it's time more than ever to reopen the issue of the reform of the Security Council?
I would think so, because I think the powers that have either an official veto or have what we call an informal veto power, with the power they exercise, I think they need to wake up and understand that unless they reform the United Nations, including the Security Council, make it much more inclusive, it is going to be very difficult for that entity to be effective. I was just taking a point from what Mr. Celso said, that we have G20 today where we have added African Union. I think that's a very salutary step where we have given a voice to a large community. I think maybe we need to expand it more to have more continental unions. There are a lot of tropical islands which don't have a say. So today, if you want to make G20, apart from United Nations, more effective, we need to have a few more voices at the G20. We may need to have them as invites or as affiliated members. It could be, because there are a lot of Asian countries which are not a part of G20. There are a lot of South American countries which are not a part of G20. There are a lot of islands which are not a part of G20. All of them are not represented. They have no voice in United Nations. They have no voice in G20. They are just not heard.
That's the greatness of the UN. It's the only pure, completely universal organization. So in my view, we should not lose the UN. It would be very dangerous, a world without the UN. Faten, you are the voice of Africa in this panel. In this business of the reform of the Security Council, one of the obstacles, it's not the only one, of course, but one of the obstacles used to be the lack of a very clear vision of what the Africans want. How many seats, which countries, and so on. Given the maybe the fact that the situation is now becoming so serious, do you think that in the next months, and for instance, for the summit of the future at New York, the African Union could make a contribution by being a bit clear to this issue of the new permanent seats at the UNSC?
Yeah, certainly. I think listening to the different points, I just wanted perhaps just one point that I wanted to also highlight is that we're speaking of the institutions or the institutional mechanisms, so including Security Council, etc. And we shouldn't lose sight of the foundational basis, which is international law. And I think putting again a universal application of international law at the center is important. Now, on the African side, we do, of course, have the Isirweni consensus, which dates back to multiple years ago. I'm not wearing any institutional hat, so I can be quite frank that even among even within Africa, the different conversations I've been part of, there is a reflection on whether we should reopen that conversation around that consensus. Because when we created it, when we reached it, it was in a particular global context, and that context has moved a lot, including Africa's own internal dynamics have moved a lot. So there is an appetite, there are reflections on it. And I think you mentioned the Summit for the Future, which happens, in fact, to be co-chaired by an African country, which is Namibia. And so it certainly does provide an opportunity for the continent. In fact, the panel that I'm part of, that is one of our main tasks, which is to help reflections and work with African countries, and particularly through the Foreign Affairs Minister of Namibia, to help consolidate some of the ideas that could be taken up by the countries as part of the engagements on the agenda for peace, but also the reforms of the international financial system, climate change, etc. So I do think there is an opportunity, but the discussion is ongoing. There is a discussion within Africa on on what we want, and perhaps one point that certainly out of the reflection that came up is that there's a lot of talk about veto rights, and what I hear more is, should there even be a veto right? Can we reverse the logic instead of saying who gets the veto, but to say, in fact, we don't need a veto because all of those there should have equal rights in terms of contributing to the discussion.
Maybe a question for each of you, and then we will move to the public and see if there are other questions. In your mind, there is not room today for creating some kind of commission to think about reforms in terms of security, and more precisely associating more the global south to security issues, in a way to provide the UN at the Summit for the Future with a range of proposals. Can we start with you?
I think it might be a good idea to have that commission within the UN, because everybody is a member there. And if someone were to look at it very openly, when I say someone, I said everyone were to look at it openly, and if everyone thinks that something good can come out of it, I think possibly that may be the best solution. Because to set up a new commission independently, to even get members to participate, the problems will start there. So in short, I think the commission within the UN for reforming the UN.
Okay. Minister within the G20 or subcommittee of the G20?
Asking me? Yes, well, I think the initiative for the reform of global governance in general has to come from something like the G20. Maybe it's not exactly the G20, but it has to come from something like the G20, because that's where you have this mixture of what you call the global south and the global north, or don't know, whatever it is, but this kind of combination of both that can provoke some sort of reform. And I think big reforms only come in times of crisis. We don't want to have the crisis to have the reform, but we have now.
Yeah,
Maybe
exactly.
climate change, of course, it's a big crisis. The pandemics are a big crisis. And we have two simultaneous wars of global potential. Both of them can become global wars. I mean, later we can be optimistic and think it will not, but we don't know. I mean, when the guy, I forgot his name, killed the Archduke of Sarajevo, he didn't know that he was starting the First World War. So we now have this very difficult situation, and I think it would be the right time to change the global governance in some ways. Yeah. It's complex because, of course, small countries also have to have their voice. So how you do all these things, I don't know, but you have to start to discuss that seriously, not only by, let us say, an initiative of the Secretary General, when then after all, everybody says, oh, let us forget about it, and so on. So I think the G20 would be probably the best place, the G20 with the modification I mentioned before.
Thank you. Faten?
I think in any event, we are in a situation currently with the global geopolitical context, but also the challenges ahead of us, and some of them were mentioned also by Honorable Shri earlier. In any case, we do need a reflection on how do we envision world peace moving forward? Because there's clearly an ambiguous failure in terms of the application of international law across the board, in terms of morality, in terms of how do we uphold world peace. Now, we do need that discussion. I think where it should be located is extremely important for legitimacy purposes, but also for impact. I think the UN is one, but I think it can get handicapped by the UN. The G20 as a new, not so new, but a constellation. I would argue perhaps it's time to consider a G20 plus, or rather G21 plus now that the AU is on it. A G21 plus as an informal group to try and reflect on, the impact or the peace we desire as an enabler eventually for economics, for climate, etc. Because I think regardless of how we see it, the current geopolitical situation and certainly the wars are handicapping. I mean, I work quite a lot, for instance, on the reforms of the international financial system, the current discussion now around climate finance. And it's blocked at so many levels because we cannot get the World Bank reformed because of geopolitical tensions between China and the US. Mm-hmm. And so that has become such a blockage to allow us to move that we need to have a conversation and led by people who are not necessarily partisan. Thank you.
Johan?
Just to follow up your comment, so that's why I think next week's meeting is super important, right? Because I mean, the two leaders would have to look around and really to agree or disagree. I mean, on things that not just important for them, but also important for other countries. But I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, China has been trying to navigate, I mean, a different form of infrastructure already, right? One Belt, One Road is a very good example of that. So I think, I mean, I think there's definitely appetite, I mean, for China to make the world more inclusive, and as a result, China might have a more influential role. I mean, together with other countries, and really to address all the pressing challenges, I mean, on this planet.
I say just one thing.
Of course.
Very quickly, because I think this was mentioned, and I didn't refer to that. I think the meeting of Xi Jinping and Biden probably is the most important event in this period, and the one that can contribute both for peace and for other questions as well, including the reform of the global governance.
Now the public, if anybody want to ask questions.
Hello? Oh, Yeah, hello, my name is Hatice Beaton. I'm the Executive Director of the G20 G7 Health and Development Partnership. Please allow me to congratulate you, Minister, for your upcoming presidency next year. Clearly, it will be another challenging one after the COVID pandemic, and India as well for an excellent presidency this year. My question is the following. Looking at our timelines, 2025, end of 2025, the first ever G20 cycle is ending. And it happens now that with Indonesia, India, Brazil and South Africa, actually the global south is leading on the G20. Now, listening to all of your conversations, my questions to you would be, number one, what are you expecting as legacy initiatives in the next 2-year cycle? And what can you do as the Global South to find solutions such as changing global governance? But also, I would like to ask you specifically when it comes to the matter of inclusiveness in the G20. Now the BRICS are adding more members to their membership next year with Saudi Arabia and the others. And luckily and finally, the G20 included the African Union into the mix. Shall we look into an institutional body where the G20 has a structural dialogue between ASEAN, CARICOM, between the BRICS and the GCC in sidelines of their G20 summits to trigger or force some of these governance structures to happen? So looking at the next 2 years, what legacies do you think can we expect from you with your leadership and your thoughts?
Well, first it will be a big challenge to meet what India achieved, which was a really very successful meeting. You know, I'm in a difficult position because I'm a member of government, so you can't interpret something that I say as a promise that that will happen, because I don't know, there are many factors that have to be dealt with. But I tend to agree with your idea that you have, first, I think in the case of Africa, you need really more 2 countries at least to have some balance. That's one thing. Which countries, I don't know. I don't want to go into that now. And I think maybe small countries or smaller countries should be represented in some way. You mentioned the CARICOM, we could mention small islands, you can mention many other things. I don't know if that will happen because it's a complex thing that you have to deal with many factors. But I think that would be a way, maybe, of having some balance. That would probably bring us to something like 25 or 28 members. But as I said, maybe if the Europeans agree to diminish a little bit their own role and to have less speakers to speak for Europe, that would probably make it easier.
And again, I just answer that in a minute.
Certainly.
Yes, again, I'm not speaking for my government, but speaking as an individual, I think it's a very good thing that could be a starting point where you could have the unrepresented groups have these meetings on the sidelines, and it could possibly evolve to G20 meeting the other powerful groups in maybe the next rounds. But yes, there could be a starting point because we need these different groupings to start coming together, because eventually I feel that maybe that is where we'll be able to build a universality.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mariano de Alba. I work for the International Crisis Group. I want to ask one specific question specifically related to rising powers. I think nobody doubts that rising powers have to play a more relevant role in trying to resolve international crisis, wars, as the minister alluded to. But we can all, my specific question is, how can rising powers also achieve a balance between their aspirations to play a more geopolitical role and their responsibility to play a role in dealing with regional crises? Right now in the world, we see important regional crises, perhaps not as deadly as the one between Russia and Ukraine and between Israel and Palestine, but still important crises that affect the lives of millions of people in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. How those rising powers, at the same time of trying to play that more global role, they also exert the responsibility to bring to end relevant conflicts in their own regions. Thank you.
Very well. Madame, peut-être.
Madam?
Very suspicious of rising powers at all. We are having a problem with the other powers. So they have not been tested. You know, we don't know what they would do. I will still put my eggs on the old powers, not because they're better, but I think the fact that you have an upcoming and emerging power that has not been tested, I think it's very problematic. It's not a question of we need to add more, but I don't know what rules they would be following. That's one. Two, as we speak, you know, children and women are dying in Palestine. 12,000 people were murdered. You can call it genocide. And 75% of that were women and children. The world came together and cannot do a damn thing. Why? Because America, you know, is stopping everyone and they don't want anything to be done. Ceasefire has become the most difficult, you know, element to say, that ceasefire. So that kind of a world is one that radicalizes where I come from, that, you know, very dangerous nationalism is on the rise in Africa, the Middle East, and, you know, there is absolutely no trust. So why should I trust France, who yesterday could not say ceasefire, but changed their mind to say ceasefire? Is it because of the politics and the economic, you know, the fact that they want more contracts with Saudi Arabia? What was the reason? But it certainly was not humanity. Humanity has died. The UN needs resuscitation. It's dead. It doesn't need a reform. And I do agree with someone who has said that. So there is less trust, and the world is becoming more dangerous. And for those of us
what is your question?
My question is, what is the big deal if we can stop a war? And who cares? You know, more power is coming in. I think new powers are more dangerous than the old ones.
Good. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Beatrice Nere from the Gates Foundation. Just to follow up on maybe a different angle is what I understand is that Brazil is actually putting at the center of its G20 agenda a very human agenda, putting at the first the fight against inequalities, an alliance for hunger, the fight against climate change, and a big focus on the reform of the international institutions. Given the previous questions and the discussion that we've had so far, what is the change of method or some of the ways that you think Brazil will be able to bring that agenda forward, and how can we help? What are the ways that you know, the people on the stage with you or in the room can also be helpful?
Heavy responsibility for Minister Mohim. Maybe, Minister, to give you the time to reflect on that, I will give the floor to other speakers.
If I may take the first question. If someone wants to have a larger voice at the table, claiming to be an emerging or rising power, and I look at the word power differently from what the second question intended, but a country that is wanting to be seen as being present at a table, yes, it has to take bigger responsibility. To quote from Spider-Man, with power comes responsibility. So, but if you see what has happened, even when the United Nations was functioning, quite a few of these countries were contributing their might, including in the African conflicts by sending the peacekeeping forces. They were contributed by a lot of countries, not necessarily only the developed countries. A lot of countries which were also seeking to be developed had contributed. But yes, I think all of this world order needs to be reimagined, reworked, and recalibrated.
Pardon?
Yeah, the first question is an interesting one, because if I look at it from an African perspective, power is a dirty word. If you come as a rising power, even if acknowledged internationally, you say, well, I'm the rising power, I'm going to solve the conflict in my back door, it's very much frowned about. And so what some of the countries, you know, be it South Africa, be it Nigeria, be it, you know, in the East, you know, or North Africa, they tended to manage that with the creation and the support of regional institutions. And I think, you know, there are a lot of questions on whether they have been effective, the regional institutions, if we look around the situation in Africa. But that is a way to try and, again, linked a bit to your point, you know, are we replacing one power with the other? Or should we more look at collective responsibility? I think inevitably you'll have a weight of the regional power. So I think my point more is, and also seeing how it's managed diplomatically, I would more personally be more inclined towards functioning regional systems, and I'm emphasizing on functioning because they're not fully functional, but that has been the way to try and manage the powers. A very critical point on trust, and I think we haven't raised it in the panel, but I think any initiative moving forward will need to focus on how do we rebuild that trust, and I think that trust comes from the application in a consistent manner of international law, coherence in positions, etc. It may be wishful thinking on my part, but I'm an optimist on this, because I do not think that we can afford a collapse of the multilateral system. I think certainly looking at it from the African side, as I said in my opening statement, we do need a form of multilateralism, and international institutions are important, but we need to rebuild trust.
Thank you very much, Faten. Yuan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think today's conversation has been focusing on sort of rebuilding the UN system, but perhaps it's because of my background. I think it's also important to emphasize on the importance of philanthropy. And this is actually was going to be the topic I thought I would be part of. But China is going through probably, I mean, the greatest wealth transition in its history. I mean, the first generation entrepreneurs benefited from the market opening up 1979 are retiring, right? They're passing their wealth to the second generation. And unlike the first generation Chinese entrepreneurs, the second generation almost like, I mean, mostly educated in the West. So in addition to take over their family businesses, they do have other interests. So I think we talked about greater power means greater responsibility. So I do envision over the next 10 or 20 years, China is going to have its own Gates Foundation. China's going to have its own Ford Foundation. China's going to have its own Rockefeller Foundation. The foundations that will have greater impact, I mean, inside of China and outside of China over the next 100 years. So I do believe, I mean, this is, I mean, perhaps one solution, not all solutions, but one solution, I mean, to some of the challenges that we're facing.
Thank you. Mr. Amorim?
So many questions in 2 minutes is almost impossible to say. But anyway, I have a problem with this concept of rising power and declining powers. Well, nobody speaks about the declining powers, but if someone is rising, it's because someone is declining anyway. But anyway, I have a problem with that. And I have a problem also to think that the rising powers should act only in Africa and South America or whatever. I think the biggest problem in which I personally was involved, together with my Turkish friends, was an attempt to have the nuclear problem in Iran. And it was a way that was 2 or 3 years later followed by the United States. But at the time, we are a little ahead of our time, the only thing. So it's very difficult to say. The only thing that I will say, I mean, in questions in terms of method, maybe we just put a loudspeaker before the rising powers to see that their voice are better heard. Thank you.
Well, of course, I should have started by saying that France is a rising power, of course, but with a lot of experience. Thank you very much to our panelists.